Welcome back to the second part of qualitative data analysis. And um, I'm going to finish off briefly describing to you some of the ways that qualitative researchers work. Remember that the big takeaway lesson from this set of lectures is that analyzing qualitative data is very detailed, very iterative, and it's an incredible amount of work as the researcher gets at what will best help answer the research question that's in front of them. After you've coded your data, you have to categorize it and organize it into bunches. Um, you start with this huge mass of data and you apply codes to it so that you can then take those codes and group them, and then you can watch the themes and not watch. It's a lot of work. I keep making it sound like it's just happens by magic, but it takes a lot of skill and thought to let the patterns emerge that you need in order to answer your research question. So you categorize, you group the codes. Um, Often this is done with major ideas based on the meaning of what those codes represent. This is very much a process in which the researcher is examining very carefully the data that's there and seeing if it fits in that coding and that category. And there are sometimes multiple categories for which the codes fit. There's often a comparison process where is that really the best category for that piece of evidence, and you're narrowing down at this point. Usually we suggest 4 to 8 useful categories. If you can get all of your data down into 4 to 8 categories, that's workable, and you're ready to start finding the evidence that you want to use as you write your narrative. Then you take the categories. Now, remember, this isn't a cut and dried process. Every researcher does it a little bit differently. I'm trying to describe some general ways that this can be done. But then the relationships among the categories. And this is critical because this kind of forms the outline or the framework for the narrative you're going to use as you report your findings. So this is also a place where the researcher's background supplies ideas and hunches and, oh, just a minute, could that actually be evidence for what I'm trying to show? So it's very tentative and it's often revisited, and this is where some categories get subsumed in others, and there may even be a few more categories created at this point. The important part, though, of forming the categories into patterns and building this outline or framework is that this is where the researcher can really question and bring to the front whether the data is trustworthy. When you go through and take these categories and start to build a framework, it may emerge that, just a minute, this person from their viewpoint didn't agree with the others, and that becomes very obvious. And so you're looking at the quality of your data and the different sources and triangulating them, which means that, oh my gosh, this is great because I found a person saying this in an interview, and I observed children doing this in an observation, and a previous researcher found the same thing, and this is wonderful because you're validating your data and what you saw. It's also important in qualitative data to acknowledge the discrepant evidence. In an ethnography, if there is a person in that cultural group or situation who sees things very differently. Remember, in ethnography, you're trying to get at the shared experiences, but it's really important to acknowledge, because new patterns may come out, or what the evidence you have from a person may actually refute the pattern that you've got. And an ethical researcher, a researcher who's really trying to get at the essence of what's happening, will acknowledge that and try to come up with explanations. And then, probably one of the most important steps for the actual writing and presenting of the findings is that you have to order your categories with these patterns. So this is where themes often become helpful. You could have your categories ordered in a pattern that's chronological or hierarchical. This is what was said about something, and here's more evidence that came along to back that up. Or very successful organization style is to use cause and effect. This is what happened first. This was the response. This is what I saw children doing in class. And I've actually participated in studies where we've done this, where we were looking at teacher behaviors and student behaviors, and it's very easy to with the right data and after a lot of observations, you can start to see that and even predict when the teacher does this, the students will do. It will have this effect on the students. I want you to understand that it's not a matter of take your categories, put them into an order, and start writing. This is where electronic really saves your hide, because you move the categories around over and over again, and you group them by the meanings that they have. It's also the best research for me is where the researcher is able to visually represent what they're seeing. Figures, diagrams of classrooms, graphs, flowcharts are really helpful in being able to see a series of events come across. You don't want to oversimplify or take the meaning out with these representations, but sometimes it's so much easier to see something diagrammed out than to read the description of it, which could get quite lengthy. It's also important to cross-analyze here, and I've seen researchers build incredible matrices where they've got codes down the left and then dots or x's going to the right that help them find the patterns between those categories and the overlaps. All of this is being done because the researcher wants to write a narrative, wants to tell a story and describe a situation so that we can have a better understanding of what's happening and the why behind it. This is the part of the power of qualitative research, because humans understand and gravitate towards stories. A good research story has details about the participants, explains the conflict, and lays out an explanation or call for action. It follows that storyline pattern that you saw in grade school. So the researcher is constantly thinking of the appropriate audience and the researcher's role. So the narrative is written from the first person in qualitative research. We did this, or we saw that, or we suggest, or I can explain this with. And remember when I talked about how important the context was and describing the setting. So it's really important in this narrative that we have this powerful description of the context, of the classroom, of the playground, of the study situation, of the social meeting place where these kids get together, whatever is the focus of your research, so that you can tell a story that's rich in the context. The story comes back to the type of study and the purposes of the researcher. So often the narrative is framed in a very naturalistic way and the story unfolds. This is most appropriate for ethnographic or case studies, as it lets the story come out of the setting. And as the story is being told, the researcher is carefully choosing the details of that story based on the research question. A phenomenological study obviously has to be framed in the context of the situation so that different perspectives can be given. Sometimes the narrative can be framed in previous theories or research, especially if it is a grounded theory approach, and that lets us as readers tie it to previous research, and this becomes more evidence of that. And finally, if you're doing a grounded theory or a critical study, sometimes it might be most appropriate to frame your narrative in the cause or the call to action and build an organizational pattern like that. You know that I like diagrams at this point. So this is a chart that kind of helps you understand, in a nutshell, different study designs and then possibilities for presenting them. So as you're going through and critiquing your articles, your qualitative articles, this may help you as you take apart and see how the evidence has been presented. So with an ethnographic study, you're going to be looking for a detailed description, and it'll probably be a chronological or a narrative pattern. That's not pattern, that's pattern. I'm sorry. Data is trying to present a cultural portrait of a group or experience. So if you're looking at a qualitative research article, is it an ethnography? You're going to need to be able to define what type of study it is. Perhaps it's looking at a phenomenon or a situation, and then the story that unfolds, what's presented for the evidence, is going to be based on both the researcher and the participant experiences, but they're probably going to give you different perspectives. You're going to be looking for different perspectives to understand the situation better. A lot of the articles that you've chosen that I've looked through so far seem to be case studies. And case studies are incredibly valuable in educational research because they let us look at a person's experience in a situation. So in those, you're going to be looking for rich description or vignettes, and the description is going to be the most important thing, and you almost let the description speak for itself, and then the interpretation is very secondary as you present the lessons learned from the case study. If your article is about framed on a grounded theory, you're going to be looking for connections, how the researcher connected the data to the theoretical schema that's been presented. You'll also see with grounded theory, you'll see a lot of diagrams, usually and flow and graphic representation of the theory and the concepts. And finally, if it's a critical study, you're going to see an emphasis in the narrative on the multiple voices and a lot of discourse and quotations and visuals that possibly represent the flow of and power structures that are there. So that, I hope these two lectures have given you a sense of the background work that goes into these rich narratives that come out of qualitative research that I would propose help us understand educational settings a lot of the time, because they're so readable, they're so understandable, and people don't need advanced degrees or detailed coursework in statistical analysis to be able to understand what's being presented in a good qualitative research study.